Welcome, dear listeners. Today, I'm here with a story that will take away all the fatigue of the day. Before we get into the story, please write where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. And if you like, what's on your mind. I read every comment. It motivates me. If you like stories like this, you can subscribe. Now, relax. The story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Cold Breath of the Thames. The first week of January greeted London with a bone-chilling cold. The faint light filtering through the window of 221B Baker Street illuminated the two figures in the sitting room as indistinct shadows. The crackling of the fireplace created a strange contrast to the howling wind outside. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair, tapping his fingertips together as he stared at the ceiling. Dr. Watson, familiar with this pose, knew his friend was wandering somewhere deep in his mind. Perhaps he was evaluating the results of a new chemical experiment, or perhaps he was inwardly complaining about the tedium of the recent run of ordinary theft cases featured in the newspapers. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, without taking his eyes off the ceiling. "What do you think the wealthiest silk merchant in London could be doing in an old factory on the banks of the Thames?" Watson lowered his newspaper and looked at his friend in surprise. "What do you mean, Holmes? I haven't mentioned anything like that." Holmes smiled slightly, that sharp, knowing smile of his. "No, you didn't. But Inspector Lestrade, who is climbing the stairs right now, will. Do you hear the urgency in his footsteps? He usually climbs 2 at a time, but now he's taking 3. That means it's an important case. Also, something must have happened on the banks of the Thames last night because of the heavy fog. It hasn't been in the morning paper yet, so it must have been discovered after midnight. And the silk merchant business." Just then the door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered, followed by Mrs. Hudson. His face was pale and he looked more tense than usual. "Holmes, Watson," he said breathlessly. "A terrible murder. Jonathan Mercer, the silk merchant Jonathan Mercer, has been killed." Watson turned to Holmes. His friend's face showed no triumph, only a calm satisfaction. "Sit down, Lestrade," said Holmes without rising from his seat, "and tell me everything from the beginning. Don't omit any details. Even the most insignificant-looking thing may be of vital importance." Lestrade sank into a chair and took a deep breath. "Around 6 o'clock this morning, a body was found at the old Cromwell weaving mill on the banks of the Thames. The mill hasn't been used for years. There's only a guard, an old man named Thomas Briggs. During his night patrol, he saw a light in the main hall, and when he went inside..." The inspector paused, as if reliving what he had seen. "Go on," said Holmes, his eyes sparkling. "Jonathan Mercer's body was found tied to an old loom. He had a silk scarf around his neck. He had been strangled with it. But the really strange thing was..." Lestrade took a small piece of paper from his pocket. This card was forced into the victim's hand. It says "debt paid," and next to it was a faded violet. Holmes suddenly jumped to his feet. His eyes lit up with that light Watson knew so well, the light of a hunter who had found the trail. "Excellent," said Holmes, rubbing his hands together. "Finally, an interesting case. Watson, get your coat. Lestrade, we're following you." Within half an hour, a carriage had brought them to a desolate area where the cold breath of the Thames could be felt. The Cromwell textile factory rose before them like a faded memory of Victorian industrial grandeur. Its brick walls were blackened by soot and time, its windows mostly broken or boarded up. Constable Peters was waiting at the factory entrance. The young policeman's face bore that familiar pallor of someone seeing a crime scene for the first time. "Inspector, gentlemen," Peters greeted them. "We haven't touched a thing, just as you requested." Holmes nodded and went inside. Watson and Lestrade followed him. The main hall was once a vast space where hundreds of workers had laboured. Now it was filled with abandoned looms, cobwebs, and dust. In the centre of the hall, where the pale morning light filtered through the windows, a horrific scene awaited them. Jonathan Mercer's body was tied to an old loom with rope. His head was slumped forward, his arms fixed to the wooden arms of the loom. The silk scarf around his neck was a pale purple colour, clearly indicating that strangulation was the cause of death. His right hand was half open, as if clutching something tightly, revealing the small card inside and a faded violet that had fallen to the floor beside it. Holmes slowly circled the body. With his magnifying glass, he examined first the scarf, then the victim's hands, then her shoes. Watson watched his friend's every move intently. He knew from years of experience that Holmes's initial examination would reveal clues that would determine the course of the case. "Interesting," said Holmes, more to himself than anyone else. "Very interesting." "What have you found, Holmes?" asked Lestrade impatiently. Holmes straightened up and turned to the inspector. "First of all, this is a premeditated murder. The killer knew the victim and had been planning this act for a long time. Look at this scarf," he pointed, but did not touch it. "This is no ordinary silk scarf. The weave is very special, probably from 20 years ago. Silk like this is no longer produced today." "How do you know?" asked Watson. "The thickness of the silk fibres and the weave pattern," said Holmes. "A technique used in the mid-1870s with certain Indian silks. Then fashion changed and the method was abandoned. Our killer either used a very old scarf or specifically saved this one. The second option is more likely." Holmes approached the victim's hand and examined the card carefully. The handwriting is neat, that of an educated person. Right-handed. The colour and consistency of the ink indicate it was written at least a few days ago. So this card was prepared after the murder was planned. Then he picked up the violet that had fallen to the ground and sniffed it. It's wilted, but not completely dry. It was picked a few days ago. Violets don't grow naturally in this season, which means it's a flower grown in a pot or in a cemetery. "A cemetery?" asked Lestrade, raising his eyebrows. Holmes smiled slightly. Violets were known as flowers of mourning and remembrance in the Victorian era. They are often planted in graveyards. This flower probably came from a grave. Our killer sees this murder as an act of revenge and is expressing it through symbols. Watson approached the body. The doctor made a quick, preliminary examination with his eyes. "Holmes, there's a slight bruise on the victim's lips, different from suffocation, and there's a strange smell around his nose." "Laudanum," said Holmes, completing Watson's thought. "I noticed that too. The victim was drugged before he was killed. It was probably mixed into his drink. This indicates that the victim came face to face with the killer and trusted him." Lestrade scribbled something in his notebook. "So he was killed by someone he knew." "Absolutely," said Holmes, "but not just someone he knew. This murder is personal. The phrase 'the debt is paid' points to an old score to settle. We must investigate Mercer's past, especially 20 years ago." Holmes began to wander around the factory. He looked carefully at the dusty floor, examining the footprints. "Look here," said Watson, calling Lestrade over. "There are two different sets of footprints. One must belong to Mercer, high-quality leather shoes, medium size. The other—" Holmes bent down and examined them with his magnifying glass. "Smaller size, old but well-maintained shoes. And look at this detail." He pointed to a spot. "The left footprints are slightly lighter than the right ones. This indicates that our killer couldn't use his left foot properly, probably limping." "A limping killer?" asked Lestrade. "Limping is more accurate. A slight limp, probably from an old injury or childhood ailment." Holmes stood up and looked around the room. His eyes fell on an old table in the corner. There were 2 teacups on it. "Watson, look at this," said Holmes, approaching the table. 2 cups. One is completely empty. The other still has tea residue. The killer and the victim drank tea together here. Watson sniffed the empty cup. The smell of laudanum, faint but present. "The victim drank from this cup," said Holmes. "The murderer didn't touch his own cup. He just placed it there to complete the scene. This tells us that the murderer was cold-blooded, methodical, and not in a hurry." Holmes examined the dust marks on the table. "A letter envelope was here. I see the mark. The killer took it or destroyed it. It was probably the letter used to summon the victim here." A voice came from outside, and everyone turned to the door. An old man entered, wearing a guard's uniform. Thomas Briggs, the guard who found the body. "Inspector, if you have any questions," said Briggs, still looking shaken. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Briggs, what exactly did you see last night? Please try not to omit even the smallest detail." The old guard took a deep breath. "I went out on patrol at midnight, as usual. Around 11 o'clock I saw a light in the main hall. Strange, I thought. This place has been closed for years. I approached, but I was scared, to be honest. I waited until morning. When the sun came up, I went inside and I saw this." "Did you notice anything else when you saw the light, a sound, a movement?" Briggs thought. "Actually, yes. I saw a figure walking away from the factory. I couldn't make it out clearly in the dark, but it was a gentleman of medium height. He was wearing a top hat. And?" Holmes asked impatiently. "His gait was strange. He seemed to be limping slightly, as if he couldn't put his left foot down properly." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. What the footprints had suggested had been confirmed by a witness. "That's very valuable information, Mr. Briggs," said Holmes. "Do you remember anything else? The man's clothing? His approximate age?" "It was dark, sir. I couldn't see clearly. But he seemed middle-aged from his movements. He wasn't as agile as a young man, but he wasn't old either. Maybe in his 40s or 50s. Holmes thanked him and walked away with a thoughtful expression. Watson came up to his friend. "What do you think, Holmes?" "I think, Watson, that this is no ordinary murder. This is revenge, and I think the killer spent years planning this revenge. The phrase, 'the debt is paid,' the silk that ceased production 20 years ago, the violets plucked from the graveyard. All of this points to an old score. What could have happened in Mercer's past?" Holmes was silent for a long time before answering. His eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Mercer was one of London's wealthiest silk merchants," he said finally. "That kind of fortune isn't made overnight, Watson. And to amass such a fortune, sometimes you have to step on others. We'll find the answer in Mercer's past, probably 20 years ago." Lestrade approached them. "Holmes, should we speak to his family?" "Absolutely," said Holmes. "But first I want to see Mercer's study at his home and his old business papers." I know, Lestrade, you're looking for the murder weapon and hard evidence. But in this case, the answers lie in the past. Someone has been waiting 20 years for this moment. To find someone with that much patience and determination, we first need to understand why they hated so much. As they left the factory, Holmes turned back one last time. The old loom with the corpse on it stood like a pale tableau in this abandoned place filled with ghosts of the past. "Watson," Holmes said thoughtfully, "sometimes revenge is like a fire that burns for years. It seems to die down, turning to ash, but beneath it, the embers continue to smoulder, and one day, when the right wind blows, the whole fire reignites." Watson nodded. He knew his friend's philosophical moments well. Holmes was not just a detective, he was also an observer who understood the darkest corners of the human soul. Now the Mercer mansion awaited them. And there, more pieces of this tragic story would come to light. As the cold January wind whipped Holmes's coat, the detective's mind had already begun piecing together the clues. A faded violet, an old silk scarf, and a 2-word note. These seemingly simple pieces would unlock the door to a 20-year-old tragedy. Chapter 2. The Secret of the Silk. Mercer Manor stood in one of Mayfair's most prestigious corners. The 3-story Georgian-style building, along with its garden, covered nearly half an acre. Above the wrought-iron entrance gate, the Mercer family crest stood out, a silk cocoon between 2 lions. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade knocked on the mansion's door around 2 in the afternoon. The elderly maid who opened the door made no attempt to hide the sorrow on her face. "Agnes Cole," Lestrade whispered to Holmes. "She's been working for this family for 25 years. Holmes nodded slightly and smiled politely at the woman. "Mrs. Cole, my condolences. We'd like to speak with Mrs. Mercer, if that's possible." Agnes Cole led them into a spacious hall. The marble floor, crystal chandelier, and oil paintings on the walls silently proclaimed the family's wealth. But Holmes's eyes ignored this opulence and focused on small details. The slightly shifted welcome mat, the layer of dust on the vase on the console, the handprint on the banister. "Mrs. Mercer will see you," said Agnes Cole. "But please be gentle, gentlemen. The poor woman is distraught." When they entered the sitting room, they found Victoria Mercer in the armchair opposite the fireplace. She was 50 years old, still a beautiful woman. Her silver-streaked black hair was neatly gathered, her black morning dress immaculately pressed. But the dark circles under her eyes and the tightness of her lips betrayed the shock she had endured. "Mrs. Mercer," said Lestrade, stepping forward. "I'm Inspector Lestrade. These gentlemen are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We're investigating your husband's murder." Victoria Mercer raised her head and looked at them. There was an icy coldness in her eyes, but it was hard to tell if it was due to grief or her natural disposition. "Sit down, gentlemen," she said in a cold voice. "I will do everything I can to help you." Holmes sat directly opposite the woman and studied her for a moment. Victoria Mercer did not seem disturbed by his gaze. On the contrary, she met it defiantly. "Mrs. Mercer," Holmes said finally, "did you know where your husband was last night?" "No," Victoria replied without hesitation. "Jonathan and I, how should I put it? We didn't interfere much in each other's lives. He was busy with his work, I with my social circle. We had dinner together last night, then he retired to his study. When I went to bed around midnight, he was still there." "Did you see him before you went to bed?" No, his door was closed. I didn't want to disturb him. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Mercer, did your husband have any enemies? Threatening letters? Suspicious behaviour? Victoria Mercer pursed her lips. Mr. Holmes, my husband was a very wealthy man. Wealth always brings jealousy and enmity. But I don't know of any specific threats. He wouldn't have told me anyway. What about former business partners? Someone he had a falling out with in the past. Something flashed in the woman's eyes for a moment, but it quickly faded. Jonathan was a ruthless man in business, Mr. Holmes. I won't deny that. But in our 20 years of marriage, I don't recall him ever mentioning his former partners. Not at all. Does the name Whitmore ring a bell? Victoria thought, or pretended to think. No, it doesn't ring a bell. Why do you ask? Holmes brushed off the question. Where are your children, Mrs. Mercer? We need to speak with them as well. Frederick is upstairs in his study. Lillian is very shaken. She won't leave her room. Just then the door opened and a handsome young man entered. Frederick Mercer, 28 years old, had inherited his father's sharp features and his mother's cold gaze. He was wearing an expensive suit, but his eyes were red and tired. Mr. Holmes, said Frederick, extending his hand. I've heard your name. I hope you'll find my father's killer. Holmes shook his hand and studied the young man carefully. Mr. Mercer, where were you last night? Frederick didn't flinch. I was at Lady Pemberton's ball. I was there until midnight. There are hundreds of witnesses. After the ball, I went home. I slept. I got the terrible news this morning. Holmes shook his head. What was your relationship with your father like, Frederick? The young man paused for a moment. It was complicated, Mr. Holmes. My father was a difficult man, perfectionist, demanding. But I loved him. And now I have to take over the business. Take over the business? Does that excite you? Frederick's eyes narrowed. What are you implying, Mr. Holmes? I'm not implying anything. I'm just asking, Victoria Mercer interjected. Mr. Holmes, my son did not kill his father. The very thought is absurd. Of course, Mrs. Mercer. I just need to rule everyone. Else out. Holmes stood up. May I see your husband's study? Victoria nodded and called Agnes Cole. The elderly maid led them upstairs to a large study. The room reflected Jonathan Mercer's personality, orderly, cold, and ostentatious. An oak writing desk, a leather chair behind it, maps and certificates of the silk trade on the walls. A safe stood in one corner, unopened. Holmes headed straight for the desk. He began examining the papers on it. Watson, would you look at the letters in that drawer? Lestrade, you examine the safe for fingerprints. Watson opened the drawer and began rummaging through the letters inside. Most were business letters, orders, payments, shipping documents. But one caught his attention. Holmes, look at this. Holmes came over and took the letter. The envelope had been opened, but it was empty. Look at the handwriting on the envelope, said Watson. Does it look familiar? Holmes held the envelope up to the light. Yes, Watson. It's the same handwriting. It was written by the same person who wrote on the debt paid card. This letter must have come from the murderer. Why is it empty? Mercer took the letter, read it, and probably destroyed it. But he kept the envelope. Maybe he thought it was evidence, or maybe he didn't care. But there's a postmark on the envelope. Look, it was posted 3 days ago. East London, Whitechapel district. Holmes put the envelope in his pocket. Then he began opening the desk drawers one by one. In the bottom drawer he found old documents, yellowed paper, faded ink. "Watson, come here," Holmes said excitedly. "Look at these." Watson bent down and examined the documents. Employment contract, Whitmore and Mercer Silk Trading Partnership. Date, 1873. "Whitmore," said Holmes. "Mrs. Mercer said she didn't recognize that name, but there are documents in her husband's drawer that have been kept for over 20 years. What happened to the partnership?" Holmes quickly scanned the documents. "Dissolved in 1875. No reason given, but look at this document, Watson. Albert Whitmore's signature, a shaky handwriting, signed under stress." Lestrade approached them. "Only cash and jewellery in the safe. No fingerprints, at least not fresh ones." Holmes stood up and began pacing the room with a thoughtful expression. "Who is this Albert Whitmore, and why did the partnership end? We need to find the answers." Just as they were about to leave the room, Agnes Cole appeared at the door. The elderly maid's face wore a hesitant expression. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice, "may I speak with you privately?" Holmes nodded and motioned to Watson. The three of them stepped out into the hallway. Agnes Cole looked around, making sure no one was listening, then began to speak. "I have served this family for 25 years, Mr. Holmes. I knew Mr. Jonathan. I really knew him. And there's something I need to tell you." "I'm listening, Mrs. Cole." "Years ago, when they were newly married, Mr. Mercer had a partner, Albert Whitmore. He was a kind gentleman. They had come to dinner with the family several times. He had a young son, 8 or 9 years old." "What happened to that partnership?" Agnes Cole's face darkened. "I don't know exactly. But one night, Mr. Mercer came home very late. He was drunk and laughing. He told Mrs. Mercer, 'Whitmore is finished.' We never heard Albert Whitmore's name again after that day." "Do you know what happened to Whitmore?" The old servant shook her head. "I heard he hanged himself a few months later, but that's just gossip. I'm not sure." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Mrs. Cole, that's very valuable information. Is there anything else you remember? Whitmore's son, for example?" "I remember the little boy. Samuel, I think his name was. He was a quiet, shy child. Once, while eating here, he fell down the stairs and hurt his foot. The poor child was in such pain. I don't know what happened after that." Holmes looked at Watson. The footprints, the limping man, the figure unable to put his full weight on his left foot. The pieces were starting to fit together. "Thank you, Mrs. Cole," said Holmes. "I'd appreciate it if this conversation stays between us." The old maid nodded and walked away. When they left the mansion, the sun was beginning to set. The short days of January plunged London into early darkness. In the carriage, Holmes was thinking silently. "Watson," he said finally, "we need to go somewhere tonight." "Where?" "To the archives of the Britannia Weavers' Guild. We need to find the origin of that silk scarf. And tomorrow morning we'll go to Whitechapel. We know our killer sent the letter from there." The Britannia Weavers' Guild operated out of an old building near Fleet Street. An elderly archivist known to Holmes admitted them late at night. "Mr. Holmes," said this archivist, adjusting his glasses, "I can assist you with silk samples. Please show me." Holmes took out a small piece of the silk scarf he had taken from the murder scene. The archivist examined it at length with a magnifying glass. He said thoughtfully. "This is a very rare sample. Bombay silk, hand-woven. Only a few firms used this technique in the mid-1870s. "Which companies?" The archivist consulted a thick ledger. "3 companies. Henderson and Sons, which closed in 1878. Crawford Silk, still in business but no longer using this technique. And Whitmore and Mercer Silk Trading. A triumphant smile appeared on Holmes's face. Whitmore and Mercer. So what happened to that company? It closed in 1875. One of the partners, Albert Whitmore, declared bankruptcy. It was a scandal, allegations of accounting irregularities and such. Then Whitmore committed suicide, and Mercer continued on his own. Accounting irregularities? Who was accused? The archivist turned the pages of the ledger. The strange thing is, Whitmore is accused in the official records. But according to rumours from that period, it was Mercer who committed the irregularities. He made Whitmore the scapegoat. Of course, these are just rumours. Holmes took notes. When were the last products made from this type of silk? Late 1874, maybe early 1875, just before the partnership dissolved. So this scarf is at least 20 years old. Absolutely. And probably from the Whitmore and Mercer collection. Holmes thanked the archivist and they went outside. It was past midnight, and the streets of London were quiet. Watson, Holmes said as they walked, the picture is becoming clearer. Albert Whitmore was swindled and bankrupted by Jonathan Mercer. He committed suicide in shame. He left behind a young son, Samuel. This boy probably injured his foot, which is why he walks with a slight limp. And 20 years later, he took his father's revenge. But where is Samuel Whitmore now? How will we find him? Holmes stopped and turned to his friend. The letter was sent from Whitechapel. We'll start searching there tomorrow. We should also check the population records at Somerset House. Samuel Whitmore was 8 or 9 years old 20 years ago. Now he's a man in his 40s. He's living somewhere, working. And we will find him. It was approaching 2 in the morning when they returned to Baker Street. But sleep was far from Holmes's mind. He sat in front of the fireplace, puffing on his pipe and thinking. "Watson," he said quietly, "this case affects me deeply. A man carried the fire of vengeance within him for 20 years. Every day when he woke up, every night when he went to bed, he must have thought of his father's face. Such patience, such determination. It's almost admirable. Holmes, are you admiring a murderer? Not the murder, Watson, the patience. You see, most revenge is impulsive and thoughtless. But this man planned, waited, watched for the right moment. He must have heard that Mercer was going to receive the Businessman of the Year award, read it in the papers, and at the very moment of his triumph, he brought him down. Watson shook his head. But it's still murder. Yes, it's still murder, and it's our job to deliver justice. But Watson, sometimes I wonder, what is true justice? Mercer may have ruined a man's life, driven him to his death. The law did not punish him, and now someone has taken justice into their own hands. Who is right? Watson had no answer to that question, and Holmes wasn't expecting one. Night fell over London like a heavy blanket, and somewhere near the cold waters of the Thames, a murderer was sleeping, perhaps convinced of the righteousness of his actions. Morning would bring new clues and new questions. But for now, Holmes's mind was circling around that faded violet, a flower plucked from a graveyard, a symbol of 20 years of mourning. Where was Albert Whitmore's grave? And did his son Samuel visit that grave every year? The answers to these questions would be critical to solving the case. Chapter 3. The Night Watchman's Testimony. The next morning, London awoke under a blanket of fog. The light filtering through the windows of 291B Baker Street was pale and lifeless. When Mrs. Hudson brought breakfast, Holmes was already dressed, his coat slung over his shoulder. "Watson," said Holmes before his friend had even finished his tea. "We have a busy day ahead. First we go to Whitechapel, then back to the factory." Watson hurriedly finished his breakfast and followed Holmes down the stairs. A carriage was waiting outside, arranged by Lestrade the night before. Whitechapel was one of London's most crowded and poorest areas. Narrow streets, stacked buildings, beggars and street vendors on every corner. Holmes's eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, recording every detail. "Watson," said Holmes as the carriage moved forward, "our killer sent a letter from this area. That tells us a few things. Either he lives here, works here, or he specifically chose to send it from here to conceal his identity. Isn't the third more likely? If he planned his revenge, he would want to cover his tracks." Holmes shook his head. "You're right, Watson, but he still needs to know this area. A stranger wouldn't come to Whitechapel and drop a letter in a random mailbox. This place is dangerous with labyrinthine streets. Our killer knows this area." The carriage stopped on Commercial Street. Holmes and Watson got out and began walking. From the code on the postmark, they had determined which area the letter was sent from. Now they would investigate the post offices and surroundings in that area. The first post office was a small, neglected shop. The elderly postman inside responded to Holmes's questions with suspicion. "Are you looking for someone who posted a letter 3 days ago?" said the postman, raising his eyebrows. "Hundreds of letters pass through here every day, sir." Holmes took a banknote from his pocket and placed it on the counter. A middle-aged man, slightly lame, probably wearing a top hat. The postman's eyes fixed on the money. Then he looked up at the ceiling as if thinking. Actually, there was someone like that 3 days ago. He came in the afternoon. He was a polite gentleman, but there was a strange look in his eyes. Cold, distant. Do you remember anything else? His clothes, his accent? He was well dressed, but not rich, you understand. Quality clothes, but old. And yes, he limped slightly. He couldn't put his full weight on his left foot. Holmes took notes. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." When they left the post office, Holmes had a satisfied look on his face. "Our killer is here, Watson. He has a connection to this area. Maybe an old acquaintance. Maybe a customer." What kind of customer? Holmes thought. Agnes Cole said Samuel Whitmore fell down the stairs as a child. He injured his foot. That could have been a permanent disability. And 20 years ago, when his family went bankrupt, he probably couldn't finish his education. He must have taken up a simple trade. For example, a shopkeeper, a craftsman, perhaps a repairman. There are many shops in this area that do that kind of work. They began to wander the streets. Holmes stopped in front of every shop, examined the windows, sometimes going inside to ask questions. As noon approached, they stopped in front of a small antique shop at the end of Commercial Street. "Whitmore Antiques," Watson read the sign. "Holmes, this—" Holmes raised his hand to silence Watson. "I see, Watson, but we won't rush into anything. First, we observe." The shop window displayed old clocks, porcelain vases, and various antiques. The sign above the door was faded but still legible. Holmes walked past without looking inside the shop and stopped a few steps away. "For now, we're just taking notes, Watson. We'll return to this shop later prepared. Now we must go to the factory. I need to speak with Thomas Briggs again." Watson was surprised. "We're not going into the shop." "Not yet. We have no concrete evidence, only suspicion. If I go in now and that man is the killer, he could escape. We need to gather more evidence first." They hailed a cab and set off for the Cromwell textile factory. The cold breath of the Thames enveloped them as they approached the factory. Thomas Briggs was sitting in the factory's small guardhouse. The old man stood up when he saw Holmes and Watson. "Mr. Holmes, welcome back," said Briggs. "Do you have any more questions?" Holmes nodded and entered the hut. A small stove was burning, with a kettle boiling on top. The walls were decorated with old photographs and newspaper clippings. "Mr. Briggs," said Holmes, sitting down, "I'd like to talk in more detail about last night, about that man you saw." Briggs sat down and poured a cup of tea. "I'll do my best to help you, sir." "How close did you see that man?" "Not very close, maybe 20 or 30 paces. But there was moonlight, and I saw his silhouette clearly." "Height estimate?" "Average height, neither tall nor short, maybe 5 feet, 8 or 9 inches. "Body type?" "Slim but not weak, a normal build." Holmes took notes. "Can you describe his gait again?" Briggs thought. "He couldn't put his left foot down properly. With every step, he swayed slightly to the right. But he wasn't slow, you understand. He seemed accustomed to walking that way. As if he'd been walking that way for years." "Yes, exactly. It seemed innate or something from long ago." Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "Now, Mr. Briggs, was the man carrying anything as he left the factory?" Briggs' eyes widened. Yes, I forgot that. He was carrying a small bag, a black leather bag like a doctor's bag, but smaller." "Interesting. Anything else?" The old guard hesitated. "There's one more thing, but I'm not sure. Maybe I imagined it." "Tell me, Mr. Briggs. Even the smallest detail could be important." "As the man was leaving the factory," he stopped. He turned back and looked at the factory. He stared for a long time. Then he bowed his head as if to say goodbye. A strange gesture, as if he were saying farewell to someone. Holmes's eyes lit up. "That's a very valuable observation, Mr. Briggs. That gesture shows that the man felt no remorse for what he did, but rather a sense of completion." Watson interjected. "Holmes, this man committed murder and feels no remorse?" "He feels no remorse, Watson, because in his eyes this is not murder. This is justice. He settled the score for what happened to his father 20 years ago. And now that account is closed." Holmes stood up and left the cabin. He began walking around the factory. Watson and Briggs followed him. "Mr. Briggs," Holmes said as he walked, "how long has this factory been empty?" "About 15 years, sir. Mr. Mercer bought it, but never used it. He would come by occasionally, check on things, but no one else ever came." "Why did Mercer buy this factory?" Briggs shrugged. "I don't know, sir. Maybe an investment, maybe something else." Holmes headed toward the back of the factory. There, at the base of a moss-covered brick wall, was a half-hidden door. "Where does this door open to?" Holmes asked. "The old loading door, sir. It's been locked for years." Holmes examined the door. The lock was rusty, but... "Watson, look at this. This lock was opened recently. Look at the rust marks. The area where the key went in has been cleaned." Watson bent down and looked. "You're right, Holmes. Someone used this door. Our killer probably entered through this door. The front door is too visible. The back door is safer." Holmes pushed the door, and it creaked open. Inside was a dark corridor. Holmes took a match from his pocket and lit it. The walls were damp and peeling, the floor covered in dust. But in the middle of the corridor, fresh footprints were visible. "Two sets of footprints," said Holmes. "One must belong to Mercer, the other to the murderer. And look, Watson, the left footprints are lighter." They followed the corridor. After a few turns, they came out into the main hall. They had reached the place where the body lay from the rear. "The killer brought Mercer through this door," said Holmes. "He probably described this door in his letter. He might have written something like, 'Enter through the old loading door.'" "But why would Mercer agree? Isn't coming to an abandoned factory at midnight suspicious?" Holmes paced the room thoughtfully. "Good question, Watson. Mercer would have needed a strong reason to accept this invitation. Either a very important job offer, a threat, or a ghost from the past." A ghost from the past? The letter probably mentioned Albert Whitmore. Perhaps the killer explicitly stated he was his father's son. Mercer realized his father hadn't forgotten what he did 20 years ago. And he wondered, perhaps he feared, could he refuse this meeting? Watson nodded. Mercer had to face his past. Yes, and that confrontation was the end of him. As they left the factory, Holmes looked around one last time. "Watson, we need to go back to the Mercer family now. I especially want to talk to the maid, Agnes Cole. We need to find out more about the contents of that letter." When they arrived at Mercer Manor, it was past 3 in the afternoon. This time, Frederick Mercer greeted them. "Mr. Holmes," said the young man in a weary voice. "Any new developments?" "The investigation is progressing, Mr. Mercer. May I speak with Agnes Cole?" Frederick nodded and called the maid. Agnes Cole came from the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. "Mr. Holmes, come in," said the woman, wiping her hands. Holmes pulled her aside. "Mrs. Cole, did you hear that a letter arrived for Mr. Mercer a few days ago?" Agnes Cole thought. "Yes, sir. 3 or 4 days ago. I gave it to him." "Did you notice anything about the letter? The sender's name?" "No, sir, just the address. But when Mr. Mercer read the letter," his face changed. He turned pale. His hand trembled. Then he put the letter in his pocket and went into his study. "Did you notice any change in his behavior after the letter?" Agnes Cole nodded. "Yes, sir. He was very tense. He couldn't sleep at night. I know because I saw the lights on in the early hours. And one night, I saw him crying in his study." "Was he crying?" Watson asked in surprise. "Yes, sir. He was crying silently. I had never seen Mr. Mercer cry in my life. He was a tough man, never showed his feelings. But that night, it was as if he had seen a ghost." Holmes looked thoughtful. The letter affected him deeply. It probably reminded him of things he had done in the past. "Mr. Holmes," Agnes Cole said hesitantly, "I must tell you something else. That night, the night I saw Mr. Mercer crying, he was murmuring a name." "What name?" "Albert. He was saying, 'Albert, forgive me.'" Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. "Thank you, Mrs. Cole," said Holmes. "This information is invaluable." As they left the mansion, Holmes's face was set with determination. "Watson, we know almost everything now. Mercer swindled Albert Whitmore 20 years ago and drove him to suicide. Whitmore's son Samuel took his revenge years later. We have motive, opportunity, witness testimony. But what about concrete evidence? Tomorrow we'll go to that antique shop, but this time as customers. I need to buy something to get a closer look at Samuel Whitmore and compare his handwriting." As night fell, they returned to Baker Street. Holmes sat in front of the fireplace, examining the debt paid card. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "this handwriting tells us a lot about its owner, a steady, controlled, patient hand. But there's a slight tremor in the slant of the letters. This indicates emotional tension." Our killer tried to appear calm while writing this card, but inside he was a storm. It must be difficult to remain calm while carrying out a 20-year revenge plan. Yes, Watson, but I wonder, how does Samuel Whitmore feel after taking revenge for his father? Is he relieved or does he feel empty? Revenge rarely gives people the satisfaction it promises. Watson looked at his friend. "What do you think, Holmes?" Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he lit his pipe and blew smoke towards the ceiling. "I think, Watson, that Samuel Whitmore may be experiencing the emptiest moment of his life right now. For 20 years, the only thing that kept him going was this fantasy of revenge. And now, that fantasy has been realized. What is left to keep him going?" This question hung in the room. Outside, the wind howled and a new night was falling over London. And somewhere in the narrow streets of Whitechapel, in an antique shop, Samuel Whitmore was perhaps asking himself the same question. Chapter 4. Shadows of the past morning greeted London with a gloomy grey tone. Holmes was already dressed and ready before breakfast. He had a list in his hand, a research plan he had prepared overnight. "Watson," said Holmes as his friend descended the stairs. "Today we're travelling into the past. We're going to Somerset House, then to the newspaper archives at the British Museum." Watson sat down at the breakfast table. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Albert Whitmore's story. Official records, newspaper reports, everything. I want to understand how this man died and Jonathan Mercer's role in his death." Mrs. Hudson brought Holmes an envelope. "This arrived this morning, Mr. Holmes, from Inspector Lestrade." Holmes opened the envelope and read the note inside. "Lestrade has completed the autopsy report. The findings confirm our guess. The victim was first drugged with laudanum, then strangled with a silk scarf. Time of death was between 10 and 11 at night. The night watchman said he saw the light around midnight. Yes, this also indicates that our killer remained in the factory for at least an hour after the murder. He probably arranged the scene, tied the victim to the workbench, and placed the card and the carnation. He didn't rush. He planned every detail meticulously. After breakfast, they hired a carriage and went to Somerset House. The enormous building was where London's official records were kept. Births, deaths, marriages, bankruptcies. Everything was recorded here. Holmes showed the official his authorization from Scotland Yard. "I'm looking for a bankruptcy record from around 1875 for Albert Whitmore, and possibly a death record." The clerk took them to the archive room in the basement. Dusty shelves, yellowed files, records organized by year. Holmes immediately set to work. "Watson, you look at the 1875 death records. I'll examine the bankruptcy files." They worked silently for an hour. Finally, Watson found a file. "Holmes, I found it. Albert Whitmore, March 15th, 1875. Cause of death, hanging. Buried in Highgate Cemetery." Holmes came over and examined the file. "Highgate Cemetery. Violets must grow there." He read the rest of the file. He left behind his wife, Margaret Whitmore, and his son, Samuel Whitmore. Samuel was 9 years old at the time. What happened to Margaret Whitmore? Holmes pulled out another file. Margaret Whitmore, February 8th, 1876. Cause of death, pneumonia. But the doctor's note says, prolonged melancholy and loss of appetite. She died 11 months after her husband. Watson shook his head. Poor woman, she must have died of grief. And she left behind a 10-year-old child. Samuel Whitmore. Holmes shuffled through the files with a thoughtful expression. What happened to the child? Is there a guardianship record? They searched a little more and found it. Samuel Whitmore was placed in the custody of his aunt, Ellen Barker. They lived at 47 Commercial Street in Whitechapel. Whitechapel, said Watson. The area where the antique shop is. Yes, Watson. Samuel grew up in Whitechapel after becoming an orphan. He probably stayed there, made that area his home. Holmes turned to the bankruptcy files. Now, let's look at the really interesting part. Whitmore and Mercer Partnership. Bankruptcy file. The file was thick, containing dozens of documents. Holmes scanned it quickly, his eyes dancing across the lines. "Here it is," Holmes said excitedly. "Look, Watson, the partnership was formed in 1871. Albert Whitmore contributed 60% of the capital, Jonathan Mercer 40%. Whitmore invested his family inheritance. Mercer invested less but had equal voting rights in the partnership. Yes, and here it gets interesting. In late 1874, discrepancies appeared in the company's accounting records. An official investigation was launched. And look at the result. Albert Whitmore was accused of embezzlement and expelled from the partnership. But last night the archivist mentioned rumours that Mercer was the real culprit. Holmes shook his head. The official records point to Whitmore. But something in this file caught my attention. He pulled out a document. The person who conducted the accounting audit, Harold Finch, and the signature at the bottom of the report. A shaky handwriting. Did he sign under duress? Or his conscience wasn't clear? If Harold Finch is still alive, we need to talk to him. When they left Somerset House, Holmes headed straight for the British Museum. The newspaper archives held the stories of the past. In the archive room, they searched through newspapers from 1875. In mid-March, they found what they were looking for. The Times, March 17th, 1875, said Holmes. Renowned silk merchant Albert Whitmore found dead at home. Authorities declare it a suicide. Whitmore had recently been accused of embezzlement by his partner Jonathan Mercer and expelled from the business world. Watson found another newspaper. Daily Telegraph, same date. A longer article. Sources close to the Whitmore family defend the deceased's innocence. However, the evidence is against him, and Whitmore appears to have taken this tragic course to protect his family's honour. Holmes pulled out another clipping. This is more interesting. Evening Standard, March 20th, 1875. New allegations in the Whitmore case. An anonymous source claims that Jonathan Mercer was the real embezzler. However, Mercer's lawyers categorically deny these allegations. So there were doubts even back then. Yes, Watson, but Mercer was powerful. He had connections. Whitmore was dead and couldn't defend himself. The case was closed. Mercer inherited the entire fortune and built his empire. Holmes wrote a few of the newspaper clippings in his notebook. There's one more thing. This article mentions Whitmore's funeral. Only a few family friends attended the ceremony. The deceased businessman's young son, Samuel, stood motionless at his father's coffin and didn't shed a single tear. The child's composure affected those attending the funeral. Watson shuddered upon hearing these lines. A 9-year-old child not crying at his father's funeral. Because instead of crying, he was swearing an oath, Watson. That child swore an oath of revenge at his father's coffin, and he carried that oath within him for 20 years. By the time they left the archives, it was noon. Holmes made a decision. Watson, we must find Harold Finch. That man knows what happened 20 years ago. and perhaps his conscience will persuade him to talk. They sent a message to Lestrade and asked for Finch's address. The reply came within an hour. Harold Finch, retired accountant, lived in Hampstead. Hampstead was one of London's quiet, affluent neighbourhoods. Harold Finch's house was a modest dwelling set in a small but well-kept garden. An elderly man opened the door. He was about 65, with white hair and tired eyes. "Mr. Finch," said Holmes. "I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We wish to speak with you." Finch's face paled. "Holmes." "Yes, I've heard your name. You're a detective." He hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. "Come in. I suppose I knew this day would come." They entered a small sitting room. Finch offered them tea, his hands trembling slightly. "Jonathan Mercer was murdered," Holmes said bluntly. "And we want to know what happened in 1875. Finch was silent for a long time. His eyes looked out the window as if he were lost in the past. 20 years, he said finally. "I've carried this secret for 20 years. Every night when I went to bed, I saw Albert's face. Every morning when I woke up, I felt the shame of what I had done." "What did you do, Mr. Finch?" The old man took a deep breath. "I was a young accountant at the time. I was auditing for the Whitmore and Mercer Company. When I examined the records, I saw that money had been embezzled, but it wasn't Whitmore who was guilty. It was Mercer." Watson leaned forward. "Then why did you blame Whitmore?" Finch's eyes filled with tears. "Mercer threatened me about my family. My wife was pregnant at the time. Mercer said, 'Either you write the report I want, or you can't even imagine what will happen to your family.' I was scared, and I wrote that report. The report that accused Albert Whitmore. Yes, and a few weeks later, Albert hanged himself. Since that day, his blood has been on my hands." Finch looked at his hands as if he could still see that blood. Holmes listened quietly. "Mr. Finch, will you give us this confession in writing?" The old man nodded. "Yes, I'm tired now, Mr. Holmes. I've carried this burden for 20 years. Did Albert's son take revenge for his father?" "We're looking into that." "I hope he did," Finch said unexpectedly. "Mercer deserved to die. I deserve my punishment, but at least I can tell the truth before I die." Holmes took Finch's written statement. The old accountant wrote everything down with trembling hands. Mercer's threats, the fake report, Whitmore's innocence. As they left the house, Holmes stopped and turned to Finch. "Mr. Finch, one more question. Why did Mercer target Whitmore? Why did he choose his partner?" Finch thought. Whitmore had begun to notice Mercer's tricks. He had started asking questions. He was becoming a threat to Mercer. And Whitmore had capital. By eliminating his partner, Mercer both got rid of the threat and seized all the wealth. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. Your statement is very valuable." In the carriage, on the way back to Baker Street, Holmes was deep in thought. "Watson," he said finally, "we know everything now. Jonathan Mercer swindled Albert Whitmore, slandered him, and drove him to suicide. Whitmore's wife died of grief. He left behind a 9-year-old child, Samuel. This child grew up as an orphan in Whitechapel, probably had a difficult life, and for 20 years he plotted his revenge. But Holmes, this information doesn't prove Samuel is the killer. It only provides a motive." "You're right, Watson. Tomorrow we're going to that antique shop. I need to see Samuel Whitmore face to face. I need to compare his handwriting. And if it is him, if he really did avenge his father, what then?" Holmes did not answer. He looked out the window at the crowded streets of London. This case affected him deeply. On one side was the law, on the other was justice. Mercer was innocent according to the law. The courts had never tried him. But morally, he had ruined a man's life, destroyed a family. And now, 20 years later, someone had taken justice into their own hands. Holmes's job was to find the killer. But this killer's story was making him think. When they arrived at Baker Street, night had fallen. Mrs. Hudson welcomed them with a hot meal. But Holmes had no appetite. He sat down in front of the fireplace and stared into the fire. "Watson," he said quietly, "tomorrow everything will come to an end. We will find Samuel Whitmore, but I must confess something to you." "What, Holmes?" "In this case, while chasing the killer, I put myself in his place. If he were my father, if someone had killed him like that, what would I do?" Watson looked at his friend. It was rare for Holmes to make such a personal confession. "Would you seek revenge, Holmes?" Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head. "I don't know, Watson, and that unanswered question troubles me." The fire crackled. Shadows danced on the walls. Tomorrow would be the most critical day of the case, and somewhere in Whitechapel, Samuel Whitmore was perhaps spending his last night as a free man. Chapter 5. The Antiquarian's Shop. Early in the morning, Holmes was engaged in unusual preparations. Watson was surprised to see his friend pulling old, worn clothes out of the wardrobe. "Holmes, what are you doing?" Holmes put on a faded brown jacket and looked at himself in the mirror. "I'm going as a customer today, Watson, not as Sherlock Holmes. If Samuel Whitmore is the killer and he recognizes me, he might escape or destroy the evidence." Watson nodded. "Well, what should I wear?" Holmes gave Watson similarly modest clothes. "You'll be a collector's assistant. I'll play the role of a retired doctor, someone who collects old watches. It's a perfect excuse to spend time in the shop." An hour later, the two men were walking through the crowded streets of Whitechapel. Holmes had even changed his gait. He was leaning forward slightly, taking slower steps. Watson was always amazed by his friend's ability to transform himself. When they reached Commercial Street, Holmes pointed to the shop from a distance. "There it is, Watson. Whitmore Antiques. We'll go inside now and be careful. Observe every detail, but don't let on." When they opened the shop door, a small bell chimed. Inside it was dark and smelled of dust. Old paintings hung on the walls. Porcelain vases lined the shelves, and antique clocks and jewellery were displayed in the showcases. Remnants of the past seemed to accumulate in every corner. A man appeared from behind the counter. He was about 45 years old, of medium height and slight build. His brown hair was streaked with grey, and his face wore a weary but attentive expression. His eyes quickly scanned the visitors. And his gait. Watson noticed it immediately. As the man stepped out from behind the counter, he couldn't put his full weight on his left foot. It was a slight, but noticeable limp. "Welcome, gentlemen," said the man in a polite voice. "How can I help you?" Holmes replied in an old and weary tone. "Good day. I'm Dr. Pemberton, and this is my assistant, Mr. Crawford. I collect antique clocks. I hear you have some rare pieces here." A slight smile appeared on the man's face. "You've heard correctly, sir. I have a few beautiful pieces. Come in. Let me show you." The man led them to the back of the shop. As they walked, Holmes watched his every step carefully. His left foot was slightly shorter than his right, just as the guard had described. "May I ask your name?" Holmes asked, trying to strike up a casual conversation. "Samuel Whitmore, sir. This shop was left to me by my father." The man opened a display case and took out a few pocket watches. "Here, these are from the 18th century. Very rare pieces." Holmes examined the watches carefully, but his real interest lay elsewhere. On the counter were small cards with price tags written on them. Handwriting. "Very fine pieces," said Holmes. "Could you write down the prices? My memory isn't what it used to be. I need to take notes." Samuel Whitmore nodded and picked up a pen and paper. Holmes watched the man write intently. Neat, controlled letters. The slant, the spacing, the pressure. It was all familiar. "Here you are, sir," said Whitmore, handing him the paper. Holmes took the paper and examined it. "Thank you. You have very neat handwriting." "My father taught me. A man's handwriting reveals his character," he used to say. Holmes's eyes met Whitmore's for a moment. What was there? Sadness, determination, or emptiness? It was hard to say. "Was your father an antique dealer too?" asked Holmes. Whitmore's face darkened for a moment. "No, sir. My father was a silk merchant. He passed away a long time ago." "My condolences." "Thank you. It's been a long time, but some pains never fade." Holmes continued to wander around the shop. Watson stood near the counter, pretending to examine the shelves, but his eyes were constantly on Whitmore. In one corner of the shop, Holmes noticed something interesting. A small display case, different from the others. Inside were old trade documents, faded photographs, and a piece of silk fabric. "What's this?" Holmes asked, pointing to the display case. Whitmore came over. "Ah, these personal mementos, not for sale, remnants from my father's business." Holmes bent down and looked inside the display case. In the photograph were a young man and a small child. The man was holding silk fabrics in his hand. The child was looking at the man affectionately. "Is this you?" Holmes asked, pointing to the photograph. Whitmore's voice choked. "Yes, my father and me. Happy times." Holmes looked closely. The piece of silk fabric in the display case, its color, its texture. It was the same type as the scarf at the murder scene. "Nice memories," said Holmes. "It must have been hard to lose your father." "I was 9, said Whitmore, his voice almost a whisper. "Nothing has been the same since that day." Holmes gave Watson a secretive look. The pieces fit together. The motive, the opportunity, the physical characteristics, the handwriting. Everything pointed to Samuel Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," said Holmes, changing the subject, "I'd like to buy one of these watches, but I need to think about it first. May I come back tomorrow?" "Of course, sir. I'll set it aside for you." Holmes and Watson left the shop. As they stepped onto the street, Holmes took a deep breath. "That's him, Watson. Samuel Whitmore, our killer." Watson nodded. "The handwriting?" "Identical. It matches the writing on the debt-paid card exactly. Also, did you see the piece of silk fabric in the shop? It's the same type as the murder weapon." "So, what do we do now?" Holmes thought. "We don't have enough evidence yet. The handwriting similarity alone may not be enough in court. We need to find something more concrete." The two men began walking away from the shop. Holmes's mind was racing. "Watson, I noticed something else. There was a door leading to the back room of the shop. Whitmore looked at that door several times, as if he had something he wanted to hide there." We can't go in and search. It's not legal. You're right, but Lestrade can get a search warrant. First, we have to present him with the evidence we have. They went to Scotland Yard. Lestrade greeted them in his office. Holmes, what did you find? Holmes listed all the findings. Albert Whitmore's story, Harold Finch's confession, Samuel Whitmore's shop, the handwriting similarity, the limp, the silk fabric. Lestrade's eyebrows rose as he listened. This is a very strong case, Holmes. But you're right. We need concrete evidence. I can get a search warrant, but the judge must be convinced. We have Finch's written confession. This proves Mercer's crime 20 years ago and gives Samuel Whitmore a strong motive. Lestrade examined the files. All right, Holmes, I'll get a search warrant for tomorrow morning. But we must be careful. If Whitmore flees, it may be difficult to find him. Holmes shook his head. He won't flee, Lestrade. He waited 20 years. He didn't rush. And I think he doesn't want to flee anymore. He's ready to accept the consequences of what he did. How do you know? From his eyes. When I spoke to him in the shop, I saw a void in his eyes. He got his revenge, but it didn't satisfy him. Now he's just waiting. Lestrade was surprised by Holmes's psychological analysis, but he didn't argue. Years of experience had taught him how skilled Holmes was at reading human nature. By the time they returned to Baker Street, it was evening. Holmes sat down in front of the fireplace and sank into thought. Watson, he said after a long silence, tomorrow we will arrest Samuel Whitmore, but I want to ask you something. What is it, Holmes? Do you think justice has been served? Mercer drove a man to his death 20 years ago. The law did not punish him, and now someone has taken justice into their own hands. Which is right? Watson took a deep breath. That's a tough question, Holmes. Legally, Whitmore is a murderer. He must be punished. But morally, Mercer didn't deserve to go unpunished. That's my dilemma, Watson. I serve the law, but sometimes the law doesn't align with justice. What do you think, Holmes? Holmes was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. Shadows danced on the walls. I think, Watson, we will arrest Samuel Whitmore, because that is our duty. But when we judge him, we must also judge what Mercer did. And perhaps, just perhaps, the jury will take that into account. A reduced sentence? Perhaps. Or maybe when society hears Whitmore's story, they'll see him differently. Not as a monster, but as the victim of a ruined life. Watson looked at his friend. It was rare for Holmes to be so emotional. This case had affected him deeply. Holmes, are you okay? Holmes smiled slightly. I'm fine, Watson. It's just, this case reminded me of some things. What people are capable of, both for good and for evil. As the night wore on, they both grew quiet. Tomorrow, the final act of the case would unfold. Samuel Whitmore would be arrested. His story would come to light. But other questions swirled in Holmes's mind. Who defines justice? The law or conscience? And what can a man do with the pain he has carried inside him for 20 years? There were no easy answers to these questions, and perhaps there never would be. As midnight approached, Holmes looked out the window. The lights of London shone like stars in the darkness, and somewhere in Whitechapel, Samuel Whitmore was perhaps sitting in his shop for the last time, looking at his father's photograph. "Good night, Albert," he might have whispered. "Your debt is finally paid." Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, the ghosts of the past still roamed the streets of London, Holmes turned and looked at Watson. "Be ready tomorrow, Watson. We're leaving at 7. And, Watson." "Yes, Holmes." "Bring your gun, just in case." Watson nodded. His friend's warning reminded him how critical tomorrow would be. And so, the 5th day ended. The 6th day would be the day all the clues came together, the day the killer's identity would be confirmed. The violets had wilted, the silk scarf was in the evidence bag, the debt-paid card was in Holmes's pocket. And Samuel Whitmore, unaware, was counting his final hours as a free man. Chapter 6. The pieces come together. The morning of the 6th day greeted London with unexpected sunshine. Such a bright day in the middle of January was rare, and Holmes took it as a good sign. Perhaps it was a sign that the case would be solved. At 221B Baker Street, everyone was awake by 6 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson had prepared breakfast early. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade were gathered around the table discussing the day's plan. "The search warrant is ready," said Lestrade, pulling a document from his pocket. The judge approved it after reviewing Finch's confession and other evidence. "We can search Samuel Whitmore's shop and home." Holmes nodded. "Excellent. But first we need to go somewhere else." "Where?" asked Watson. "Highgate Cemetery, Albert Whitmore's grave." Lestrade looked surprised. "The cemetery? Why?" Holmes took the wilted violet from the evidence bag on the table. This flower was found at the crime scene. Violets symbolize mourning and fidelity in the Victorian era. And they don't grow naturally at this time of year. This flower most likely came from a cemetery. From Albert Whitmore's grave? Exactly. If I'm right, violets should be growing around the grave. And perhaps Samuel visited his father's grave before the night of the murder and picked a flower from there. It had symbolic meaning for him. He may have wanted to inform his father's spirit that the revenge was complete. Watson was fascinated by Holmes's psychological analysis. "But what does that give us, Holmes?" "If the graveyard keeper saw Samuel Whitmore on the night of the murder, that would be an additional witness statement. And if the violets around the grave match the flower we have, that's another piece of physical evidence." After breakfast, the 3 men boarded a carriage and set off for Highgate Cemetery. Located in the hills north of London, this cemetery was one of the most magnificent burial grounds of the Victorian era. Gothic monuments, angel statues, and ivy-covered gravestones made it almost a fairy tale place. At the cemetery entrance, an elderly caretaker greeted them. Holmes explained they were from Scotland Yard and asked about Albert Whitmore's grave. "Whitmore, Whitmore," muttered the guard, looking at a thick ledger. "Yes, here, in the eastern section, under the oak tree. No one visited for years, but in the last few years, someone has been coming regularly." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Who comes?" "A middle-aged gentleman, quiet, polite. He comes every March, sometimes more often. He sits at the grave for a long time, sometimes for hours, and every time he leaves a violet." "How does this man walk? Does he have any physical characteristics?" the caretaker thought. "Now that you mention it, yes, he limps slightly. He can't put his full weight on his left foot." Holmes gave Watson a triumphant look. "When did this man last come?" "A few days ago, late at night. Normally the cemetery is closed, but that man somehow got hold of the key to the back gate. I didn't see him, but the next morning there were fresh footprints beside the grave, and a violet was missing." "Missing?" "Yes, sir. I grow violets around the grave, at that gentleman's request. He gave me money a few years ago and said, "There should always be violets on my father's grave." So I took care of it. But that night, one had been picked. Holmes pulled out the wilted violet and showed it to the guard. Could this violet have come from there? The guard looked closely at the flower. "Certainly, sir. It's the same variety I grow. Look at the shape of the leaves, the edges slightly wavy, the same flower." With this crucial information, the three walked towards the grave. In the eastern section, in the shade of a large oak tree, stood a simple but well-kept gravestone. Albert Jonathan Whitmore, 1840–1875. Beloved husband and father. His innocence is known in heaven. Holmes stopped in front of the gravestone and read the inscription. "His innocence is known in heaven," he said thoughtfully. This is a declaration that the deceased man was innocent, probably written by his family. Around the grave, violets were indeed growing. The purple and white flowers retained their vitality despite the winter cold. Holmes bent down and examined one carefully. "The same species, Watson. Leaf shape, flower size, everything matches. The violet we have is from here." Lestrade took note. "This proves Samuel Whitmore was here on the night of the murder." "More importantly," said Holmes, "it proves his motive. On the night of the murder, he first came to his father's grave. Perhaps he prayed, perhaps he made a vow. Then he picked the violet and went to the factory. He wanted his father's spirit to witness the completion of his revenge." As they left the cemetery, Holmes paused for a moment and looked back. Albert Whitmore's grave stood alone under the oak tree. 20 years ago, this man had been wrongfully accused and driven to his death, and his son had visited this grave for 20 years, growing violets, perfecting his plan for revenge. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "this graveyard has been Samuel Whitmore's real home for 20 years. Every place he lived was temporary, but this was permanent, his father's side." Watson nodded but did not reply. This thought had affected him deeply. The carriage was now heading towards Whitechapel. It was 10 o'clock and the streets were getting crowded. Holmes, Lestrade, and Watson fell silent as they approached the antique shop. Everyone was aware of the seriousness of the task ahead. They stopped in front of the shop. Holmes took the debt-paid card from his pocket and placed it next to the price list Samuel had written yesterday. "Watson, Lestrade, look at this." The two handwritings were almost identical. The slant of the letters, the spacing, the pressure. Every detail matched. "This is undeniable, even to an expert," said Holmes. "It's the same handwriting." Lestrade took a deep breath. "All right, Holmes, time to go inside." The shop door opened and the bell chimed. Samuel Whitmore looked up from behind the counter. When he saw Holmes, his face showed surprise, but then understanding. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "you used a different name yesterday." Holmes unbuttoned his coat and stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. I was playing a role yesterday, but today I come as myself." Samuel Whitmore looked at Lestrade's uniform. "Scotland Yard, so you've come at last." His voice carried neither fear nor regret, only weary acceptance. "Samuel Whitmore," Lestrade said in an official tone, "you are under arrest for the murder of Jonathan Mercer. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Samuel nodded slightly. "I know, Inspector. I was expecting this." He held out his hands, ready to be handcuffed. But Holmes intervened. "One moment, Lestrade. Mr. Whitmore, we'd like to search your shop. Do you give your permission?" Samuel shrugged. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I have nothing to hide now. It's all over. Holmes headed for the back room of the shop. Watson followed him. It was a small room used as both living quarters and storage. In one corner was a narrow bed, in another, old furniture and boxes. Holmes began searching systematically. He opened drawers, rummaged through boxes, examined shelves, and finally, he found a wooden box under the bed. Watson, come here. They opened the box. Inside were the evidence of a 20-year revenge plan. Old newspaper clippings, news articles about Jonathan Mercer, photographs, pictures of Mercer's house and factory, and a notebook, hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. Holmes opened the notebook and began to read. This is a diary, Watson. Samuel recorded everything for 20 years. His father's death, his mother's illness, his own struggles, and his research on Mercer. Watson looked over his shoulder. He planned everything. Yes, look at this page. Mercer is going to receive the Businessman of the Year award. This is perfect timing. I'll bring him down when he's at the top. The date is 2 weeks before the murder. At the bottom of the box was something else, a small silk pouch. Holmes opened it and looked at the objects inside. His father's pocket watch, his mother's earring, and an old photograph of Albert Whitmore with his family. These are his treasures, Watson, the last mementos he has of his family. Holmes took the box and the notebook. They went outside to hand them over to Lestrade. Samuel Whitmore stood in front of the counter, handcuffed. When he saw the box in Holmes's hand, a bitter smile appeared on his face. You found my diary, he said. I wrote everything down, a 20-year story. Holmes stood in front of the man. Mr. Whitmore, I want to ask you a question. You don't have to answer, but I'm curious. Ask away, Mr. Holmes. Was it worth it? You planned this revenge for 20 years. You dedicated your life to it. And finally, you succeeded. But now, how do you feel? Samuel Whitmore was silent for a long time. His eyes gazed into the distance as if looking into the past. I don't know, Mr. Holmes, he said finally. For 20 years, I lived for one purpose. Every morning when I woke up, I thought of my father's face. Every night when I went to bed, I imagined the day Mercer would be punished. And that night, when that night came, he paused, his voice trembling. That night, when I looked into Mercer's eyes, I saw fear. But I also saw remorse. The man cried, Mr. Holmes. I never forgot Albert, he said. I see him in my dreams every night. Those words surprised me, but it was too late. A 20-year plan cannot be changed in one night. Holmes listened silently. And then it was over. Mercer died. My father's revenge was taken, but I fell into a void, Mr. Holmes. The thing that had kept me going for 20 years was gone. And what was left? Nothing. Just emptiness. A tear rolled down Samuel's cheek. You're asking if it was worth it. No, Mr. Holmes, it wasn't. My father didn't come back. My mother didn't come back. And I became a murderer. How am I any different from Mercer? This confession affected everyone in the room. Watson bowed his head. Lestrade coughed and looked away. Only Holmes continued to look into Samuel's eyes. Mr. Whitmore, Holmes said softly, your father was an innocent man, and you wanted to honor his memory. Your method was wrong, but your intention... I can understand your intention. Samuel nodded. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. That's one of the kindest things I've ever heard. Lestrade stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, I'm taking you to Scotland Yard now. You'll appear before a judge tomorrow. Samuel looked at his shop one last time. He had lived, worked, and planned in this small space for 20 years. And now he was saying goodbye to a place he would probably never see again. "Mr. Holmes," Samuel said as he walked out the door, "I have a request." "What is it?" "Could someone leave violets on my father's grave? I won't be able to go anymore." Holmes paused for a moment. Then he nodded. "I promise, Mr. Whitmore, there will always be violets on your father's grave." Samuel Whitmore seemed somewhat relieved by this promise. Lestrade escorted him outside and put him in the waiting police car. Holmes and Watson remained in the shop. Around them stood the silent witnesses to a 20-year tale of revenge. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "this case, it affected you deeply." Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, this was no ordinary murder. It was tragedy answering tragedy. Mercer destroyed a family 20 years ago, and from the ruins of that destruction, Samuel Whitmore was born. Not a killer at first, just an orphaned child, but pain and anger transformed him. Do you think justice has been served?" Holmes thought for a long time. "Legal justice has been served, Watson. The killer has been caught and will stand trial. But true justice? I don't know. Has Albert Whitmore's spirit found peace? Has Samuel Whitmore's pain been eased? It's not my place to answer those questions. I only seek the truth. The rest is a matter for humanity and history." As they left the shop, the sun was beginning to set. The narrow streets of Whitechapel were bathed in golden light. Holmes paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. "Watson, tomorrow is the final act. Samuel Whitmore will be tried, and I will testify as a witness. But tonight I want to think a little." Watson walked beside his friend. Both were silent. There was much to say, but neither put it into words. Sometimes silence was the most powerful expression. And tonight, the silence that fell over London was writing the final pages of a 20-year tragedy. Tomorrow, everything would come to an end. Samuel Whitmore had been caught. The evidence was complete. But in Holmes's mind, one question still echoed. What was justice, and who had the right to define it? These questions might never be fully answered, but life would go on. The streets of London would write new stories, stage new dramas. And Sherlock Holmes, as always, would continue to pursue the truth. Chapter 7. The Debt is Paid. On the morning of the 7th day, a heavy silence greeted London. The sky was covered with leaden clouds, but it wasn't raining, as if even the city was holding its breath. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat in front of the fireplace, lost in thought, with his pipe in his hand. He hadn't slept all night. Watson could tell by the dark circles under his friend's eyes. "Holmes," Watson said anxiously, "you need to rest. You have court today. You're going to testify as a witness." Holmes lifted his head and looked at his friend. There was a different expression in his eyes than usual. Not fatigue, but deep thoughtfulness. "I couldn't sleep, Watson. This case, it keeps turning over in my mind. I see Samuel Whitmore's face. That last look when he turned around as he left the shop. Was it regret, relief, or just emptiness? I'm still not sure." Watson sat down beside his friend. "You always act on logic, Holmes. Emotions don't usually affect you. This much. You're right, Watson, but this case is different. It's not just a murder. It's the final act of a 20-year tragedy. And I witnessed this story not just as a detective, but as a human being." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the morning bustle of Baker Street had begun. Vendors, workers, servants. Everyone was going about their lives unaware of Samuel Whitmore's story. "You know, Watson," said Holmes, looking out the window, "every person walking down this street has a story. Perhaps some, like Samuel, live with a pain, a rage, a fire of vengeance burning inside them for years, and we never know until that fire explodes." Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a tray of breakfast. "Mr. Holmes, Mr. Watson, you must eat. It will be a long day." Holmes thanked her, but he had no appetite. He drank only a cup of tea and returned to our thoughts. Watson ate his breakfast silently, not wanting to disturb his friend. At 9 o'clock, a carriage was waiting at the door to take them to the Old Bailey. London's most famous court was a symbol of justice. But today, Holmes couldn't help questioning what justice meant. The carriage slowly made its way through the crowded streets. Holmes looked out the window but seemed to see nothing. His mind was reliving the journey that had begun 6 days earlier. The abandoned factory on the banks of the Thames, the corpse tied to the loom, the debt-paid card, the faded violet. Each clue had led him step by step to Samuel Whitmore. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "what do you think Samuel will think in prison? He lived for 20 years with a single purpose, and now that purpose has been fulfilled." "What is left behind?" Watson thought. "Perhaps he will find peace, Holmes. Or perhaps his conscience will not leave him alone. The human mind is a complex thing." Yes, complex. And sometimes the most complex minds are hidden in the simplest-looking people. Samuel Whitmore was a modest antique dealer. His neighbours knew him as polite, quiet, harmless, and for 20 years no one saw the storm inside him. The courtroom was crowded. Jonathan Mercer's murder had caused a huge stir in London society. Journalists, curious citizens, members of the Mercer family. Everyone was there. Victoria Mercer sat in the front row, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on the defendant. Frederick and Lillian were beside her. Lillian's eyes were red. Clearly she had been crying. Frederick sat stiffly, his expression difficult to read. Samuel Whitmore stood at the defendant's podium. He was neatly dressed. His lawyer had probably provided these clothes. His hair was combed, his face shaved. There was no fear or remorse on his face. Only a calm acceptance, the peace of knowing that a moment he had been waiting for a long time had finally arrived. Holmes studied Samuel carefully. There was a nobility in the man's bearing, a nobility unbecoming of someone who had grown up in poverty. Perhaps it was something inherited from his father, Albert Whitmore's final gift to his son. The judge was an elderly, authoritative man. His silver hair, wrinkled face, and sharp eyes commanded respect. He silenced the courtroom and began the proceedings. "Defendant Samuel Whitmore, you are charged with the premeditated murder of Jonathan Mercer. Do you accept the charges?" Samuel stood up. His voice was calm and clear, without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. I killed Jonathan Mercer, and I did it completely consciously as part of a 20-year plan." A murmur rose in the courtroom. People looked at each other, whispering. They hadn't expected such a clear confession. The judge banged his gavel. Silence. The prosecutor stood up and read the charges. Murder, premeditated homicide, trespassing, damage to private property. The list was long. With each charge read, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Samuel listened to each charge with the same calmness, nodding his head slightly. Then it was time for the witnesses. Inspector Lestrade was called first. Lestrade described the crime scene, the findings, and the course of the investigation. He was professional and detailed, recounting everything in chronological order. The initial inspection at the factory, the analysis of the silk scarf, the laudanum evidence, the guard's statement. Then Thomas Briggs was called. The old guard's legs trembled as he stepped onto the witness stand. He recounted what he had seen on the night of the murder. The light, the silhouette, the limping gait, the top hat. Every detail pointed to Samuel Whitmore. "Could you see that man clearly, Mr. Briggs?" asked the prosecutor. "I saw his silhouette, sir. It was dark, but there was moonlight. And his gait. I'll never forget that gait. He couldn't put his left foot down properly." Harold Finch was also heard as a witness. The elderly accountant was almost collapsing when he took the witness stand. With a trembling voice, he recounted the events of 20 years ago. Mercer's threats, the false report, Albert Whitmore's innocence. The courtroom listened to this confession in shock. "I carried this secret for 20 years, Finch said through tears. "Every night I saw Albert's face. I betrayed him, and now at least I can tell the truth." Finch's tears were the strongest proof of his sincerity. The jurors looked at each other, some shaking their heads. This confession had the power to change the course of the trial. And then Sherlock Holmes was called. Holmes took the witness stand. His tall, slender silhouette, sharp features and attentive eyes set him apart from everyone else in the room. The famous detective swore in with his usual calm and sat down. The prosecutor began his questions. "Mr. Holmes, how did you solve this case?" Holmes explained his method. The clues, his observations, the chain of logic. From the faded violet to Highgate Cemetery, from the silk scarf to the Whitmore and Mercer partnership, from the handwriting to the diary. He explained how each piece fit together. The jury and the audience listened, spellbound. "My first observation at the scene of the crime," said Holmes, "was that this murder was premeditated and personal. The killer knew the victim. He had shared tea with him, conversed with him, and then he killed him with cold calculation. This was not a sudden fit of rage. This was the result of years of waiting for revenge." "Mr. Holmes," the prosecutor finally said, "what do you believe was the defendant's motive?" Holmes paused for a moment. Then he looked directly at Samuel Whitmore. The two men's eyes met. Samuel bowed his head slightly to Holmes, as if paying his respects. The motivation was revenge. But not simple revenge. Samuel Whitmore lost his father at the age of 9. Albert Whitmore was wrongfully accused by Jonathan Mercer and driven to suicide. A few months later, his mother died too. Samuel grew up as an orphan in the narrow streets of Whitechapel. For 20 years, he carried the memory of his father and the pain of injustice within him. Holmes paused and took a deep breath. The room listened, holding its breath. This revenge wasn't something planned overnight. It was the product of a 20-year process. Samuel initially wanted to prove his father's innocence. He researched, collected documents, sought witnesses. But legal avenues didn't work. Mercer was very powerful. His connections were extensive. The courts, the police, the newspapers. None of them listened to him. And at some point, Samuel decided to take justice into his own hands. The prosecutor nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." The defense attorney stood up. He was a young but intelligent-looking man. With his glasses, neat clothes, and confident demeanor, he gave the impression of a good lawyer. Mr. Holmes, what do you think of my client? Is he a monster? Holmes hesitated. This question put him in a difficult position. As a witness, he had to be impartial, but impartiality was nearly impossible in this case. No, he said finally. Samuel Whitmore is not a monster. He is a victim of circumstance. The trauma he experienced as a child shaped him. The pain he carried for 20 years eventually erupted. That does not excuse him. Murder is murder, but it makes it possible to understand him. A murmur rose from the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel again. The defense attorney continued. Mr. Holmes, what do you think about Jonathan Mercer? Was he an innocent victim? Holmes took a deep breath. This question encapsulated the essence of the entire case. Jonathan Mercer was never charged under the law, but morally, he ruined a man's life. He defrauded Albert Whitmore, slandered him, and drove him to his death. He destroyed a family. And for 20 years he lived without paying for that crime. In wealth, in respectability, receiving awards, society applauded him. The business world held him up as an example. But no one asked about the corpse buried beneath the foundation of that fortune. The prosecutor objected. Your Honor, the witness is accusing the victim, the judge thought, frowned. Objection overruled. Mr. Holmes's opinion is on the record. This case involves extraordinary circumstances, and all perspectives must be considered. Holmes continued. Let me say this. This case is not just a murder case. It is the story of a tragedy born of injustice. Mercer committed a crime 20 years ago and went unpunished. Whitmore took justice into his own hands 20 years later, and now he will be punished. Which is fair? It's not my job to answer that question. I'm just presenting the facts. But I do know this. If true justice had been served 20 years ago, we wouldn't be here today. After the testimonies ended, it was Samuel Whitmore's turn for his final statement. Samuel stood up. He looked at everyone in the courtroom, slowly, as if wanting to etch every face into his memory. At Victoria Mercer, Frederick, Lillian, the jury members, the judge, the reporters. And finally, at Holmes. Then he began to speak. Your Honor, members of the jury, distinguished audience, do I regret what I did? I've asked myself that question thousands of times, and the answer is complicated. He paused, his eyes drifting into the distance, as if traveling back 20 years. I was 9 years old when my father died. I can still hear my mother's screams that night. When we found my father hanging from the ceiling, the world stopped for me. Everything I had believed up until that moment was shattered in an instant. Nothing was the same after that day. My mother wasted away with grief. The light in her eyes faded, her smile disappeared. She stopped eating, she stopped sleeping. Within a year, I lost her too. And I, at the age of 10, was left on the streets of Whitechapel. Samuel's voice trembled, but he continued. The room was plunged into a deep silence. For years I asked myself why. Why did my father die? Who killed him? As I grew older, I learned the truth. Jonathan Mercer had swindled my father, slandered him, destroyed him, and he faced no punishment. On the contrary, he had become rich, powerful, a respected man. I would see his photos in the newspapers, at balls, openings, awards ceremonies, and every time I saw him, the fire inside me grew a little more. It burned me from the inside out for 20 years. Samuel looked at Victoria Mercer. Her face was still expressionless, but something stirred in her eyes. Mrs. Mercer, I apologize to you. Your husband may have been a good husband to you, a good father to your children. Maybe he came home in the evenings and played with them, told them stories. Maybe you bought presents at Christmas, cut cake on birthdays. But he was my father's killer. He may not have directly stained his hands with blood, but he killed him. And I just did the same thing. I became a monster, just like him. Sobs rose from the room. Lillian Mercer was crying, her shoulders shaking. Frederick held his sister's hand, but his own face was pale. Samuel turned to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I admire you. Your intelligence, your determination, your commitment to justice. You caught me because I needed to be caught. Maybe deep down I wanted to be caught. Because this burden I've carried for 20 years, it was too heavy. I felt it on my shoulders every day. Every night I saw my father in my dreams, looking at me, trying to say something, but I couldn't hear his voice. And now, finally, I can let him go." Finally, he turned to the jury. 12 people of different ages, different professions, the people who would judge him. "You will find me guilty, I know. And you are right, I killed a man. According to the law, I'm a murderer. But I want to tell you something. In this world, not everything that is legal is fair. And not everything that is fair is legal. Jonathan Mercer was legally innocent, but he wasn't fair. I am legally guilty, but am I fair? You decide that. I only know this. My father finally found peace, and that's enough for me." Samuel sat down. The courtroom fell into a deep silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. The jury withdrew to deliberate. The discussions lasted 2 hours. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade waited in the court hallway. The light streaming in through the window grew fainter as the afternoon wore on. "Holmes," said Watson, "what do you think? What will the verdict be?" Holmes shrugged, his eyes fixed on the light streaming through the window. "He'll be found guilty, that's certain. But the sentence? The jury heard his story. Finch's confession, Mercer's true face. Perhaps that will mitigate the sentence, perhaps not. Predicting justice is harder than seeking it." Lestrade joined them, a cup of cold tea in his hand. "Holmes, I must admit this case has affected me too. I've been doing this for 20 years, but I've never seen a case like this. Every case is unique, Lestrade, but some get under your skin and never leave." When the jury returned, the courtroom filled again. Everyone stood up, the judge entered, everyone sat down. The air was tense, breaths were held. The jury foreman stood up. He was a middle-aged man with a serious face. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at the judge. "Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant Samuel Whitmore guilty of premeditated murder." It was the expected verdict. The courtroom accepted it silently. Samuel bowed his head slightly, as if he already knew the outcome. The judge turned to announce the sentence. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the documents in front of him, then at Samuel. "Samuel Whitmore, I find you guilty of premeditated murder. Normally the penalty for this crime is death." The courtroom held its breath. Lillian Mercer stifled a scream. Reporters raised their pens. "However," the judge continued, "I am taking into account the extraordinary circumstances of this case. The crimes committed by the victim against the defendant's father have been documented by Harold Finch's testimony. This can be considered a mitigating factor. Furthermore, the defendant's trauma, his orphanhood, and the years of suffering he endured have also been taken into consideration. The judge paused, as if weighing his own decision. The courtroom hung on his every word. Samuel Whitmore, I sentence you to life imprisonment. The death penalty will not be imposed due to mitigating circumstances. May God have mercy on your soul. A murmur rose from the courtroom. Some looked relieved, others disappointed. Victoria Mercer's face remained expressionless, but her shoulders slumped slightly. Samuel Whitmore listened to the verdict calmly. Then he looked at the judge and bowed his head. Thank you, Your Honor, for your justice. As the guards led him away, he passed Holmes. He paused for a moment, the chains clanking. Mr. Holmes, he said softly, keep your promise. Violets on my father's grave. Holmes nodded. I promise, Mr. Whitmore. Every year in March, there will always be flowers on your father's grave. Samuel smiled slightly, a genuine smile for the first time. His eyes showed a peace he hadn't seen in 20 years. And then he was led away from the courtroom, from freedom, from life. After the court adjourned, Holmes and Watson stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over London. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Is it over, Holmes? Watson asked. Holmes nodded, but his eyes were distant. The case is over, Watson. But the story never ends. Samuel Whitmore will spend the rest of his life in prison. The Mercer family will face their father's dark past. Harold Finch will live with the burden of his conscience. Agnes Cole will sleep every night knowing the secrets of the family she served for 25 years. And what about you, Holmes? Holmes took a deep breath. I, as with every case, will move on to the next. Other murders, other mysteries, other stories. But this case, I will not forget this case, because it reminded me of something. What did it remind you of? Holmes paused and turned to Watson. There was a rare softness in his eyes, the humanity hidden behind those sharp gazes. How fragile justice is, Watson. There are laws, there are courts, there are punishments. But true justice is sometimes beyond these things, and sometimes it is nowhere to be found. We detectives find the truth, but the truth doesn't always bring justice, and justice doesn't always bring peace. The two friends began walking toward Baker Street. London's streets were filled with the evening crowd. The lanterns were lit, the shadows lengthening. Life went on as it always did. Holmes, Watson said after a few steps, I want to ask you something. Ask, Watson. If you were in Samuel's place, if he were your father, what would you do? Holmes was silent for a long time. His steps slowed, his eyes fixed on the pavement. The question had shaken him deeply. I don't know, Watson, he said finally. And this not knowing troubles me, because I always find the answers. That's my job, my reason for being. But the answer to this question, perhaps it can never be found. Perhaps some questions are destined to remain unanswered. By the time they reached 221B Baker Street, night had fallen. The street lamps were lit, warm light spilling from the windows. Mrs. Hudson welcomed them with a warm fireplace and hot tea. You've had a difficult day, gentlemen, said the old woman kindly. Get some rest. Holmes sat down in his usual chair. He lit his pipe and blew smoke rings at the ceiling. The flame danced in his eyes. Watson, he said quietly, tomorrow is a new day, new cases, new mysteries. But tonight I want to think. Watson nodded and sat down in his own chair. The two friends sat silently in the warmth of the fireplace. Words were unnecessary. Their years of friendship filled the silence. Outside, London hummed. Millions of stories, millions of lives, millions of dramas. The poor and the rich, the guilty and the innocent, those seeking justice and those fleeing it. All on the same city streets, under the same sky. And tomorrow, one of them would knock on Sherlock Holmes's door. But tonight, the detective was only thinking about Samuel Whitmore, Albert Whitmore, Jonathan Mercer, about the fine line between justice and revenge, about how 20 years of pain could transform a person, and about that question within himself, the one he couldn't answer. Somewhere in Pentonville prison, Samuel Whitmore was perhaps spending his first peaceful night. The 20-year burden had been lifted. Now there was only waiting. But waiting could have its own peace. At least he no longer had to search for a purpose. And somewhere in Highgate Cemetery, violets swayed gently in the night breeze. Albert Whitmore's grave stood silently in the darkness. The branches of the oak tree cast silver shadows in the moonlight. The man buried here 20 years ago could now rest in peace. His son had kept his word. The debt had been paid. But the price had been heavy for everyone. Holmes took a deep drag on his pipe and closed his eyes. Samuel's last words echoed in his mind. My father has finally found peace, and that is enough for me. Was it really enough? Holmes couldn't know, but he knew one thing. Tomorrow would be a new day, and London would continue to keep its secrets, as it always had. The fire in the fireplace was slowly dying down. Watson had begun to doze off in his chair, and Holmes, gazing into the darkness, was waiting for the next mystery. Because there was always a mystery in London, and Sherlock Holmes was always ready to solve it. And so, we come to the end of another story, my dear listeners. The story I shared with you tonight was perhaps one of Sherlock Holmes's most emotional cases. A detective's intellect, a murderer's patience, and the dark shadow of a 20-year-old revenge. All came together in this story. Now think about it. Samuel Whitmore lost everything when he was 9 years old. His father, his mother, his home, his future. And for 20 years, he lived for one purpose. It's not easy to debate whether this purpose was right, but we can say this. The human spirit can sometimes show incredible resilience. Sometimes, however, this resilience can lead down the darkest paths. Jonathan Mercer was never punished by the law. His wealth, power, and connections protected him for years. But life sometimes administers its own justice. Perhaps this reminds us that what we do comes back to us sooner or later, sometimes when we least expect it, in ways we never imagined. Holmes's mastery in this case was, as always, magnificent. A chain of clues stretching from a faded violet to a cemetery, from a silk scarf to a 20-year partnership. Each piece connected to the next, and eventually the whole picture emerged. But this time Holmes didn't just catch a killer. He laid bare the full dimensions of a tragedy. So, do you think justice was served? I'll leave that question to you. Mercer drove a man to his death 20 years ago and went unpunished. Samuel took his revenge 20 years later and will now spend the rest of his life in prison. Who was right? Who was wrong? Perhaps both were right. Perhaps both were wrong. Justice can be that complicated sometimes. How did you feel while listening to this story? Maybe you sympathized with Samuel, or maybe you condemned his methods. Maybe you thought Mercer deserved his end, or maybe you thought no one deserved to die like that. Whatever your feelings, they are all valid, because a good story is one that makes us think, question, and stirs something inside us. Sherlock Holmes remained pensive for a long time after this case. According to Watson, he sat in front of the fireplace for days, puffing on his pipe. Perhaps he questioned what justice meant within himself. As a detective, his job was to find the killer. But as a human being, the killer's story had deeply affected him. And at Highgate Cemetery, on Albert Whitmore's grave, fresh violets appeared every March. Who left these flowers? Maybe Holmes kept his word. Maybe the cemetery caretaker continued the tradition. Maybe some secrets should remain secrets. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. That way, you won't miss Sherlock Holmes's other adventures. Every week we share a new mystery, a new story, a new adventure with you. Write your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about Samuel Whitmore? What would you have done in his place? Do you think justice was served? I'm curious to hear your answers to these questions. See you in the next story, my friends. The foggy streets of London are full of new mysteries, and Sherlock Holmes, as always, is on the trail of the truth. Take care and remember, every mystery has a solution. You just have to know where to look. Goodbye.